So this game was part of the One Game a Month challenge number 68, which had the optional game theme of heat. Normally I might have gone about the idea process with brainstorming and sketching, but this idea basically came fully formed. An endless runner style game, but with the first person perspective, and the theme of heat simply became lava rising up underneath you. I did think about maybe having platforms that shut you up quicker in the game, but I could never really make them fit in. The rest of the game would be made up of realistically looking stone and wooden platforms, and what would platforms that shut you up look like? Spring-loaded platforms? I couldn't really figure it out, so it never really made it in.
For planning out a project, there are many tools you can use. For a complicated project, I would normally use OneNote or something similar to keep track of ideas, and possibly something like Trello to keep track of my progress, especially if working with other people. But for this simple project, I just used a Word document. One of the issues I've often run into is getting bogged down in details too early. Therefore, one of my goals for this project was to be very strict about working on the gameplay before I worked on the presentation. That meant making a prototype and an alpha version of the game that are basically just white boxed.
In my mind, the idea with a prototype is to prove out an idea with as little work as possible. A good prototype can prove whether an idea is good or bad without getting bogged down in details for a game that might never even work.
Whiteboxing is the process of using simple models to set up the layout and gameplay of your game without having to worry about aesthetics. Unity comes with a pack of standard assets that can be used for this, so instead of having to model walls and staircases before I even know whether the idea is good, I just start using placeholders immediately. Unity also comes with a pre-made first-person controller script that I use for the game. I end up adding a few things to it, as you'll see, but that is the biggest piece of the game that I did not make myself. Once I figure out the right pieces to use, I started building a test chunk of a level that you can climb up and ensure that it tiles well if you copy it above itself. I make a basic plane with an orange material for the lava and add a simple script that raises the lava an adjustable amount every second. Then I create a second script that will move the bottom level chunk up to the top based on the player's location. At this point I felt like I'd finished the prototype, proving that it was fun to climb the tower, but going back and looking at my design, I decided that it made more sense to also add the double jumping and the falling platforms to the prototype before continuing. Then I spent some time adding in the ability to double jump. This resulted in some fun bugs for a while, but eventually I got there, and it really made you feel like you have a bit more of a chance to save yourself if you make a bad jump. I then proceeded with the unstable platforms. Another script is needed. This one decides randomly whether a platform should be unstable and assigns a different material to indicate it. If the platform is unstable, it checks for collision with the player and falls down. At this point, I made a centralized game manager where I can manage the instability of the platform, so I don't have to worry about setting the value on every individual platform. Finally, the platforms will have to be correctly reset after having fallen down when the chunk is moved up. This involved saving their initial position and setting them back to it when moving the chunk. So approximately 4.5 hours into the project, I had a really solid prototype that has definitely proved to me that it's a fun idea that will work.
Okay, so let's sum up. We have the three main parts of the game working now. A first-person controller that can double jump, randomly falling platforms, and an endlessly scrolling world. Okay, so what's the difference between an alpha and a prototype? Well, to me at least, the prototype is just a concept, whereas the alpha will have some version of all of the game in there, so you can get the experience from start to finish.
So I made a new to-do list for the alpha assets needed and missing features like the menu and score system. I did a bit of sketching in Krita, thinking about the size of the platforms and my idea of using octagonal platforms. I got started in Blender making a simple platform and tested it out in the game. Then I got to work on a staircase, which took a bit more thinking about. I wanted to ensure that the staircases would fit together with additional staircase pieces. Finally, I made a simple 8-sided cylinder for the tower walls. This was all the blocking modeling done, which took about half an hour. I then tried laying out the level in the new octagonal tower. This took a bit of trial and error to get the proportions that made sense, but when I got to that point, it was just a matter of designing the chunks and repeatedly testing. I then turned my attention to the menus and the user interface. I implemented a simple game over menu I'm not at all worried about how things look at this time, I just want it to work and feel like a complete experience. Here I ran into an issue that took me quite a while to figure out. I wanted you to be able to use the mouse in the menu, but the mouse got hidden by the first-person controller script, so you won't see the mouse cursor when steering with the mouse. In the end, it wasn't very complicated to get to act correctly, but it is another one of those cases where working with a piece of code you didn't write yourself, like the first-person controller, can make life difficult. I didn't write the code to hide the cursor, so I didn't know where or how to unhide the cursor. And at this point I had the game over menu working and showing the final score. Moving on to the main menu, I created an empty scene and a script to control the menu. The complicated thing here was the high score list. I looked into a couple of different ways to store data in Unity, some of them rather complicated, but eventually I came to my senses and simply used Unity's player preferences system where you can save simple data types easily. And here we have the alpha version, which took an additional 6 hours to make, so around 10.5 hours in all so far.
So the plan for the beta part of the development was really simple. Replace all the placeholder models with high quality models with texturing, and adjust all the lighting and add post-processing effects. The process of making the high quality assets is much the same for all of them. You take the simple model that you started out with and you subdivide it a lot of times so you can sculpt little details and crevices into it. You then make another low poly version, low detail version that will be shown in game, and you make that ready for texturing by UV unwrapping it. You can then bake all the nice little details from the high quality model down on the low quality one, and then at the end I do all the coloring by texture painting the model.
But this process, at least for me, takes a lot of time. It took me around 10 hours to make the stone platform, stone staircase and wall assets. At this point I was severely running out of time. This was basically the day of the submission deadline. But I realized that there was a 4-day grace period for handing in the submission, so I decided to push my luck a bit. I really wanted to do separate models for the weak platforms and stairs. I had imagined wooden versions that would collapse into bits, though I was getting a bit worried about the additional work at this point. At first I tried going about sculpting out these pieces as well, but I quickly realized I didn't have time for it, and I didn't really have a good idea how to sculpt the wood detail. Instead I went for smooth wooden boards and simply created a color texture in Krita. Together with the UV unwrapping that followed the grain of the texture, this gave a pretty good effect. Now I had the models ready for the collapsing platform. All I needed to do was set up each wooden piece to act as a physical object. All the pieces were then set to be inactive and are controlled by the platform script. Exactly like the single unstable platforms were before, except with lots of separate pieces instead of just one. Here I ran into a bit of an issue. I had to recreate my levels with the new platforms because I hadn't been clever when I set it up in the first place. This took a little while. I then went back to Krita and started creating a tiling lava texture. Krita is great for this since it has a function that makes it a breeze. When I was happy with the texture, I applied it to the lava plane. The same texture was also used as an emissive texture for the material, making it glow in brighter spots. My plan was to make a special shader to allow the lava to move in a cool, realistic way, but since I was low on time, I simply made the lava rotate slowly to give it a bit of movement. I then added the post-processing stack from Unity to the project. These are effects that really make a big difference to the look of the game. The main ones I'm using are color grading, which allows you to change the exposure and tone of the final image, ambient occlusion, which adds shadows in crevices and can really make your details pop, motion blur, which gives a more filmic smooth look to the game, and bloom, which makes bright objects look more realistic and overexposed. This will make a big difference for the lava especially. When I'm happy with the look, I go over to my main menu scene and add the new models. I create a nicer background and I also add some post-processing effects there.
So, about 30 hours in, the game is done. It's the evening of the 3rd of September and I submit the game and I crash in bed. But as you can probably tell, the game doesn't really look what I showed in the beginning of the video yet.
The thing is, I couldn't help myself and kept working on the game and changed a few things. I went over to Unity's new high-definition render pipeline, which also meant that I could use some other nice new effects like volumetric fog. I also got around to making that custom shader for the lava, making it move in a cooler way. I added sound effects to the game and redid the menu. And I finally added proper difficulty, where the lava rises quicker the higher you get, and more platforms become unstable the further you get up.
So there you have it. I finished the game in about 40 hours, which I think, all things considered, is pretty good. I'm really happy with how the game turned out. I'm especially happy with how I managed to concentrate on gameplay and whiteboxing before getting bogged down in the details of the modeling and texturing and post-processing. I think that really paid off. So I hope this was fun to watch and entertaining. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. Please write me a comment. I'm gonna try to do this again for my future projects. So please let me know if you'd like me to do anything in a different way, or if you like this format.